Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Suresh Kochattil. Today here we are in a conversation that is special. That's because the gentleman sitting before me is also special. Somebody who has walked through the Indian industry, being in the Tata Group for a long time, board of many other companies, and now, of course, running his own company. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome R.Gopalkrishnan. Welcome to Nationalist Hub, sir.
Thank you, Suresh. Nice for bringing me here.
Yeah. So, just to give our viewers a kind of snapshot of what Mr. Gopalkrishnan is all about, he was the executive director of Tata Sons till he retired. He was in the boards of Tata Power, Tata Technologies, Asconobel, Castrol India, ABP Private Limited. Of course, he was also the vice chairman of Hindustan, which was the Indian subsidiary of Unilever. Worked in international markets from UK to Saudi Arabia, everywhere. And of course, he has seen it all, done that. And when we look at this experience, I think he is the right person to ask a lot of questions about today's corporate world. Mr. Gopalkrishnan, once again, welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So my first question to you would be, you were from Calcutta, St. Xavier's, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes.
And then IIT Kharagpur?
Correct.
Which is also geographically very closer to where you were in Kolkata. After that, of course, you went into the industry. I think you started as a technology person, computer analyst.
That's correct. In 1967 as a young trainee.
So my memory is not that bad. So I just read up somewhere today morning. So the question was, when you were, I mean, it's very, very early days when today's generation wouldn't even know about those days, if you ask them. What was it like working in those days versus what you feel is like working nowadays? What's changed?
You know, my response to you is going to be based obviously on my experience, and I cannot generalize. In those days, anybody of my age group will recognize what I'm saying. It was damn tough to get a job. There was nothing called campus recruitment. But on the flip side, the number of graduates coming out was much lower. The pressure from the population was lower. And the competitiveness of the jobs, I must admit, must have been a bit lower. Because if you have too many rats trying to enter only one hole, the competitiveness among the rats becomes more. So that was the situation. And naturally, as a young person of 21, I felt, like many of my contemporaries would have, that we are going through a huge change. Just like young people today feel. And the old way of writing double foolscap paper with carbon copy, ledgers, all that was giving way to punched cards and discs, and computers were coming into the workplace with a lot of agitation, controversy and resistance by unions. But it was an interesting time, and I find the Kala Chakra being repeated because when I see young people say that never has there been so much change, I think to myself and I smile quietly, every generation has felt the same.
That's true.
When my father was flying around in an aeroplane, my grandfather thought, this is the end of the world, Kali Yuga has come. How can you get into the air and fly like Hanuman? And he also thought life is changing at a very fast pace. But it's been good fun.
So when you moved from a computer analyst into a marketing function and then a general management, those early days, management wouldn't have been as, to quote, say, so romantic as it is today, or so looked up as it is today. The early days of management.
You know, it was a point of transition. I didn't know it at that time. Very often in history, when we look back, it's clear to us there's a transition. But at the time you're going through the transition, you don't know it. Just like you don't know that you're passing over from childhood to adolescence or to adulthood. Management institutes were just about coming up. If I had joined one of the IIMs, I would have been the first batch of IIM Calcutta or IIM Ahmedabad, because they started in 64 or 65, and that's when I would have joined, and I would have belonged to the 1966 batch. But somehow management also looked like a very flaky profession. You know, engineering, costing, chartered accountancy, law, these were considered well-established professions. So I never did a management degree. I went to IIT and had no intention whatsoever of going into sales or marketing or anything, because I thought I'm a technologist.
But you did something in Harvard, isn't it, in between?
That's much later.
Much later.
That's much later. I went for the advanced management program, but that was 20 years after I'd become a director of Hindustan Lever.
That brings me to the next question, because when you look at your portfolio which you worked with, major part is with the Tata Group. Of course, we all knew that, that you were very close in the inner circles of the Tatas at that time. But when you worked with Unilever, for example, people romanticized even the MNC setup of those days, stiff upper lip, British culture. How different was working with Unilever and then coming back and working with the Tatas?
In some ways it was identical, in some ways it was very different. What was identical? Both were very strong organizations. Both were very ethical, and they insisted on ethical behavior of their executives. Both were very committed to sustainable growth, which means stakeholder benefits, not just shareholder benefits. So those were the similarities. Both did all their work in English. If I look at the differences, Unilever was a very Anglo-Saxon mindset. Tata was a very Indian mindset. And the differences between an Anglo-Saxon mindset and an Indian mindset can be captured dramatically without too many words by saying the Anglo-Saxon mindset comes from the Greek tradition. The black and white and the thin line separating it. The Indian mindset comes from the Indian tradition, which is there's a very big area which is grey. There's a thin sliver at the two ends, which is clearly right and wrong. And that manifested itself in many ways in the working of the company. But as I said, their goals were exactly the same. Ethical business, establish good brands, give value, and take care of the state. So it was there were adjustments to be made in the transition, but it was not a journey through hell.
Mr. Gopalkrishnan, when you look at, you worked in the Arabia unit of Unilever before you switched over to India. You can correct me on the timelines and the geographical lines also. But when you look at working in Gulf those days, and we're talking of must be the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken.
Early 90s.
90s.
Late 80s.
Early 90s. So those days the Gulf would have just been getting into the construction boom and getting into that thing, which is different from today's, say, Saudi Arabia, where Mohammed bin Salman says, I'll make it to Europe in another 7 years' time. So when you look at the difference today, when you look at the Gulf, and then, of course, you came back into India, was there a different way of working there, and also the consumption pattern, because you were working in Unilever, which is basically a product company? How different was it, sir?
Well, to the extent that cultures and people's habits and attitudes and mindsets are different, the end consumer, of course there were differences. But to the extent that it was Unilever, and I was going from Hindustan Lever to a Unilever company, there were no differences. The second thing, of course, is I walked into and grew up in the culture of Hindustan Lever, which had preceded me by decades. It was already well established. There I was the chairman, and I was giving birth to the company. It was a startup. So they were very different experiences. And my challenge at that time, which I really enjoyed, and I think I grew up in that environment. The challenge was, how can you make it similar without making it identical? And that's a challenge of life everywhere. You know, how do you raise your children in some ways similar, but in other ways different? So that was good, interesting profession.
It's like when you look at levers, working for levers, we'll call it levers, by the way. So when you look at Unilever or something, it's all driven by sales. Of course, customer service being there. Numbers are the most important thing. And for a person like me who's worked in sales, we know how it is. Every day evening, the numbers count. But when you came, say, for example, I'll just take a switch over to the Brook Bond. Let us come there, where you worked.
Which is also part of Unilever.
So when you look at that brand, because I remember one time when I was in Bengaluru working with the Times of India, Brook Bond, I think, got into spices. I think they exited that market later, having realized that market is quite different. In terms of learning, what was Unilever, say, Arabia, and say, Brook Bond, India?
You know, there's not that much of a difference.
Okay.
Firstly, your perception that Unilever or Hindustan Lever is all sales is flawed.
Okay, sir. I stand corrected.
Because you have to remember in those days, today that may be true, but I have retired 25 years ago, so I can't comment. But in those days, you had a license permit, Raj.
Oh yeah, I remember.
And so you had a limited capacity. And the challenge was to maximum utilize that capacity. Because if you exceeded it by a little bit, you got a show cause notice. And within that capacity, to extract the best value, so premium products rather than, so it was very much more production driven. And since there was price control, you kept lowering your cost because you couldn't put up your price. And raw material prices will behave the way raw materials do. So it was not at all a sales. Yes, but in the latter part of my career, when liberalization and all happened, it was very much a brands driven. I wouldn't call it sales, I would call it brands
driven.
And in some ways, Tata is not different. Before I joined Tata's, if necessary, the fourth tire wasn't available in the truck warehouse, they would dispatch the truck with 3 tires. I mean, I'm exaggerating to make my point, to make it a bit funny.
I understand.
Because, or if you couldn't serve a top-class Western French wine you would say, okay, I'll take the next best, But that is not the case anymore. And now you have to be truly global. And that's what Ratan Tata did for Tatas. Helped it to adapt to the new world. And that he led from the front.
Which is where I'm coming into, because all last 15 days we've been speaking about Ratan Tata, his memories. And of course, today you are in Hyderabad to speak about Jamsetji Tata at the ASCI, the Administrative Staff College of India, where HMA has a session, the Hyderabad Management Association. When you look at from Jamsetji to, say, Ratan Tata, we'll not get into Noel right now, but when we get into this entire generation, because we see the family tree, there was something very Indian in them, isn't it?
Oh, it's absolutely Indian.
So they wanted, it was more nationalist. I don't know how to call the right word. I don't know how to coin it. But Jamsetji, I think, felt very proud to be an Indian and call himself that, and also show that India can do it, which is something that India of today is also doing. Please.
I think Jamsetji was certainly a nationalist, because I remember when I joined Tata's, which was only in 1998, I would often see a board placed in a factory floor or a boardroom, which would say, before you take a decision, ask yourself 3 questions. Is it good for India? Is it good for the community? Is it good for the Tata shareholder?
Okay.
In most companies, it will be reversed.
Correct.
Right? So the fact that the decision tree had been marked out, and in multiple companies, Tata Power, Tata Chemicals, so it is not that. So I think he was definitely a nationalist. And in fact, if I may go one step further, I would argue, at the risk of somebody challenging me, which is fine, that if you take who are the top nationalists of the 19th century, 1850 to 1900 or whatever, certainly you will find Gandhiji, you will find Rabindranath Tagore, you may find other people in the field of science, but in the field of entrepreneurship, you will definitely find Jamsetji Tata.
In fact, one of the anecdotes...
He is one of the greatest Indians we have produced, but you don't celebrate him that way.
Think of one of my friends who literally lived in Jamshedpur, who grew up there. When I told her that I was interviewing him, she said, one thing, the early days, I believe, when Jamsetji set up the Tata Steel, it was said that anybody could go there and get a job. That was a kind of atmosphere there, If you are technically trained or if you had some skill, you could get into a slightly better thing. Otherwise, you are a worker, but you got a job. The Tatas had that feeling. I mean, having worked in the Taj Group myself, I can say that even now, I keep saying it. I wrote about it extensively after Ratan Tata passed away, saying that the HR policies are the best. There's nothing beating the Tata. They've worked in 2 other big corporates before and after that. But I think they are the best. Do you think, in terms of human resources, springing up from where Jamsetji started to where Ratan Tata ended, and of course, it continues with Noel, that is there. But still, what defines Tata's is this care for human resource, humans as such. Do you think it's something very unique, or is it that it has been refined over a period of time?
It is distinctive, but I'm afraid I don't agree with you. It's not distinctive in the way you described it, but in an alternative way, which I'd like to explain. It is very distinctive, but not in terms of HR policies and processes. I would say Tata's not top of the line.
Okay.
But it's distinctive insofar as it's a very compassionate group. And that, if a person shows compassion, you think he's good in HR.
That is what is
But that doesn't mean he's good in processes.
Correct.
And when you have compassion, it's difficult to reduce compassion into processes. A, B, C, D, E.
True.
It's damn tough. Compassion comes from the heart. So if I put heart plus mind as the two influencing factors in a leader's decisions, if I compare Unilever, I would say it's maybe 65-35. Mind and heart. If I look at Tata, it may be 50-50. Both are strong on both, but the balance is slightly different. Just like in a family, you may say one brother is very nice, the other brother is a little formal.
In fact, that's what, since you are the executive director of Tata Sons, and obviously you would have been almost all decisions springing from there. Of course, the trust holder entire thing, but Tata Sons is a big
So
chunk.
let's
of
be
shares.
clear, the running of Tata companies is with Tata Sons.
Sons, that's it, not that one. The trust only have shares in the
Trust have shares, and as a shareholder, they have some rights, but they don't run the company.
So when you look at that, let us look at Tata Steel anyways done. Taj Group came from, of course, Jamshedji again as such. But when you look at the down the line products, when Tata's moved into new lines, today if I go into a Star supermarket, for example, one near my house, every product is Tata there, including the toothpaste, which we never expected, say, 6, 7 or 10 years ago. Do you think the Tatas are today, as typically as said, from a needle to an elephant, they can make anything?
I'm not sure we can make anything. That's not true.
Yeah, I'm just putting a very broad brush.
But certainly, compared to any other corporation anywhere in the world, Tata as a group over 150 years have demonstrated a ability to make mistakes, the perseverance to recover from the mistakes, but to be sarvavyapi. And therefore, from the time you get up in the morning, from the time you brush your teeth, to the cup of tea that you have, from the car that you ride to work, from the TV that you see in the evening, you'll find Tata everywhere.
I still drive a Tata car.
and that is distinctive for sure. And it's a great secret that Tatas have as to how they managed it, but I'll leave that for another.
Well, you were part of the Bombay house, so you know how it functioned. But Tatas had a lot of successes. There's no doubt about it. Even today, the legendary line which I wrote when Ratan Tata passed away was, "Okay, Tata, goodbye." Behind every other truck, you would see those good old days. But there were some mistakes. There were some errors of judgment, you can call it.
Of course.
Of course, when Tata's invested in Land Rover, there was a big hue and cry. Was it the kind, the steel companies in the UK where they invested, the Corus and others. But in Indian context, it was Nano. Do you think either the Tatas were ahead of time or they got the product wrong?
You know, Tata's mistake with Nano, if I had to give a metaphor, it's like a daughter that you have in the house who's very chiseled face and her looks are very Western, and you put her into a sari and a garara. The packaging of the Nano, and I use the word packaging in a consumer sense, not in terms of the color of the car or anything, went wrong, for which Tata must take the responsibility. And the mistake that I think Tata made was allowing everybody to say it's a cheap car. When everybody said it, and we got a lot of press coverage for Nano, I was on the board at that time. I felt very happy that without spending any money,
You got the publicity.
you're getting awareness, because that would have cost you several crores, to achieve. But everybody described it as a cheap car. And media do influence. You're in the media business, you understand this. And if I keep saying that Suresh has got a very pleasant face, a person who doesn't know Suresh says, yeah, I understand he's a very pleasant man. But if I keep saying that he's a duplicitous character, then people start believing, but there must be something behind the smile. And that's what happened to the Nano. I don't blame the press for it, but nobody wants to buy a car which is cheap.
What about the international investments where they're all, now of course they're making money, but when it was invested, there was a hue and cry saying...
Yeah, there was a hue and cry. It's very funny. This hue and cry comes from your fraternity, the media. And their job is to make the hue and the cry of what they are seeing today, not to project into the future or comment on the past. And they do their job. But Tata is a very patient investor. And I'm sure every investment has not been great, but most of the investments have worked out very well. When Ratan Tata became CEO back in 1993 or 91, people, if you read the newspapers at that time, they said, where did this guy come from? What has he achieved? He's the wrong guy to fill up JRD shoes. And now people are saying the same thing. Noel Tata is an unknown guy and so on. That's not the way, because you cannot look at the exit image of a leader and compare it to the entry image of his successor. In any company, you'll find that to be incompatible. That's not surprising.
Mr. Gopalkrishnan, having sat on the board of so many companies, of course, I wouldn't like to get into one controversy. If you don't like to comment, you can leave it, which is Cyrus mystery case. I know you were not then in the company. But do you think at the same level, when you see a bickering at the board level, what image does it convey down the line to the company? Of course, they sorted it out pretty fast. But still, Ratan Tata literally had to come out of retirement and take over the company again. Do you think it spoke well about creating the next line of leadership, or was it, even in case of after his passing away, Noel Tata came in, there was no succession planning that was done? Maybe was it deliberate?
Came in, not Noel Tata.
No, that's what. But I'm just talking of from a trust level. That's it. I mean, just
trust,
maybe.
We are not discussing the trust.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Not the business.
That's what.
If you want to discuss social activity,
that is. I understand. So that is a non-family man, a non-Tata man who heading the company.
He's a Tata man, but he's not a family.
Family part of that. So when you look at that, when you look at the boardroom battle, they're not just confined to Tata.
In any company, in any family, if there's a tussle, even an ordinary person who's unknown to the rest of the world in your neighborhood, the father and the son don't get along, the brothers don't get along, it becomes a source of gossip. So to try to push it under the carpet that a difference of opinion had to surface in the public domain is ridiculous. So, but then you have to deal with an issue that you're faced with. And whatever the issue was, it was not the same issue in the mind of one person compared to the other person. So Ratan Tata or Cyrus Mistry or Mukesh Ambani and Anil Ambani or whoever.
Yeah, that's right. True.
Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Since I wasn't there, I don't know the facts. But the misunderstanding had to be sorted out. And just like between a husband and a wife, sometimes the misunderstanding is sorted out by counseling and time. Sometimes it results in a cut.
For a divorce.
And every divorced person is not a bad person. Every person who's compromised with his spouse, his or her spouse, is not necessarily a good person, a nice person.
When Tata Consultancy Services began its early days, you obviously would have been there in the thick of the action. Do you think it will grow into such a big conglomerate?
Nobody thought, even Kohli didn't. I wrote a book on Tata Consultancy Service. Nobody did. You see, very often we use hindsight to attribute vision to the original leader. But I don't think anybody knew. And there are many things in life that work that way. When a child is born in your house, can you really predict that child will become a top journalist You don't. If he becomes a very good journalist or a good scientist or whatever, people say Suresh has raised his children very well. One became a top journalist, one became a top scientist. So people attribute motives and vision and foresight based on the results rather than that person fundamentally having some great foresight or vision. And that's fine. I'm not objecting to it, but I'm just...
No, I think the way I'm asking the question, our viewers should not get a feeling that I'm asking all kind of controversial questions.
No, you can ask controversial questions.
Yeah, no, but I'm asking because good things everybody knows about the Tatas. But there was also another issue with the Tata Steel. I'm told, I'm not really sure, that Ratan Tata was not exactly happy with what was happening at Tata Steel. Maybe it didn't grow at the pace that he expected it. Maybe he didn't expect the competition to spring up from a license Raj to an open economy. Do you think in the back room, was there something happening on Tata Steel?
No, in fact, it's quite the opposite of what you say. I was there, so I can tell you.
Yes, sir.
When Ratan Tata became chairman, he said, our companies are not really globally competitive. But everybody thinks it's competitive because you got used in that license permit Raj environment. So he caused two things to happen. One is to get some consultancy, McKinsey or somebody, to demonstrate how uncompetitive we were. The second is to adopt a business excellence model so that you cannot change this overnight. This is an atherosclerosis built up over license permit Raj of so many years. And I would even go to the extent of saying it was be credit to him, aided and abetted by Jamshed Irani, that they touched all the key points of where Tata Steel was flabby. Technology, finance, greenhouse gases, number of people. And they took 7 years, but they made it a world-class plant. And that was done in high degree of collaboration between Ratan Tata as a non-executive chairman. He would go and sit there with Jamshed Irani, not to do his job, but to ask the questions. So I think it is my experience is quite
that's very interesting, because as we get closer to the closing this conversation, I would also ask you about the books you've written, the number of books you wrote. And our viewers obviously would be interested in knowing which of the books, why did you write them, and which of them would you recommend to our readers to read?
See, I can't recommend, because it's like saying which of your sons
is better.
It's difficult. But I'll tell you how I got into writing books. I got into writing books because by the time I was about 60, I felt I had acquired two things in life. One is a certain amount of money to live comfortably when you get older, but not enough for the pink papers to write about you, which is fine with me. But the second thing that I acquired, which was invaluable, was experience of dealing with multiple kinds of situations. The challenge for me was, like for anybody who's 60, your experience is like wheat. It is shoved into a silo, which is in your brain,
Right.
and it lies there. And as you know, wheat in a silo is of no use to a hungry man unless you take it out kilo by kilo and
Powder it.
make something. You can make bread, you can make naan, you can make croissant, you can make whatever you want out of it. And I felt I have to do that. So, if I may say, making a consumer product out of my experiences was my challenge. And so I sliced and diced, and I said, I'm not going to write management theory because I'm not an academic. I'm not going to write how I did it, how I turned around, I'm not in that category. I said, my job is to market experience. How do you market experience? So the first one I chose, I'll just take the first and the last one.
Sure, sir.
So that I don't go into all 20 of them. 20 books is a hell of a lot to discuss in our podcast. The first one was, how does leader rely on intuition? Because life's greatest decisions are taken by intuition, not by rationality.
True.
But most of us think we are very rational. Whom do you marry? Who do you stay married to? How do you raise your children? Who do you appoint as CEO? There's no rationality in it. Up to a point, yes. And I came to the conclusion that intuition is the line extension of rationality.
It's a hunch.
The hunch. But the hunch cannot be used right at the beginning of the journey. When you've gone as far as you can and now you're in danger of falling off the cliff, then it opens out like a parachute. And there are risks in it. And I wrote my first book called The Case of the Bonsai Manager, which went on to sell several 10,000 copies. And that got me motivated. And then I went on to other subjects like, how do managers really learn? Not necessarily from classrooms. And my latest books are about how do you embrace the future? Why is it that in the boardroom, where our perception is people are very rational people sitting around a table discussing things rationally, the left eyebrow being raised or the wink from one guy to the other guy seem to make the difference. And how do you deal with it? So I've had a very wide range, but all my books, except one, which is based on my family history, which is from a little village in Tanjore in 1823. But barring that, 19 books are all based on my life experiences. And when you share an experience, it becomes a story.
That's
and
right.
if the story is truthful and credible, the reader says, I've been down this road before. And that's nice.
Wonderful, Mr. Gopalkrishnan. As we close, last 1 minute, I won't take more than that, a couple of minutes rather, is to ask you about today's generation. Today, you have unicorns by the hundreds in India today. So how are we looking at a world where we grew in a license Raj to an open economy, and today we have 23 and 24-year-olds who are billionaires to that effect? How did that happen? How is it happening?
The first thing is I am not fully in favor of all that's happening now. But that doesn't mean I disapprove of what's happening. What is happening? Today we've lighted a fire, which is a good thing, but we have no checks and balances on that fire. When you build a company, this is what I keep telling entrepreneurs, at the risk of being considered a old fuddy-duddy, that's fine. I am an old fuddy-duddy. I say when you have a baby in the house, you not only have to raise that child to grow well by nutritional food, etc., but you must allow that child to develop values and a goal in life.
That's true, sir.
What do you do with your startups? You want to become a unicorn. Do you want a 5-year-old son who's 70 kilos in weight? So spend your time trying to think about a purpose for your company.
Wonderful. Wonderful. In fact, I wish we could go on and on. Next time, of course, you are in Hyderabad. We'll speak more extensively and look forward to your talk this evening at Administrative Staff College of India, which is brought to you by HMA. Mr. Gopalkrishnan, wonderful talking to you, sir, at Nationalist Hub. And your pearls of wisdom, if I may call it that, plus your 20-odd books would give direction to any youngster today, because you have sat on many a thrones, on many a boardrooms and seen it all. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure talking to you, Suresh.
Thank you very much. Jai Hind.